All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our lecture on the Mongol Empire. So this is our second lecture in unit number 2, which is the networks of exchange. We've already gone over the Silk Road, and we went over especially the impacts of the Silk Road and just how important trade is. Remember, trade isn't just trading goods. I mean, that's one aspect of it, but it's also trading cultures and knowledge and technology and all those wonderful other things that we talked about in our previous lecture. But today, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at why the Silk Road came back. I mean, the Silk Road was around earlier, far before our time frame for this particular class, but it came back around the year 1200, and we're going to need to see why that is. I'll give you a hint today. It's partially because of the Mongol Empire. This is really where we start our history. I mean, in Unit 1, I was talking a lot of different aspects of all those cultures we went over, but I was really reaching back to a time before 1200 just to build a bit of context so we have a better understanding of what we're going over in Unit 2. We really start with the Mongol Empire because in this class, we want to see why globalization occurs. Like, why do we live in a much more globalized society today? And that globalization goes all the way back to the Mongol Empire. So you'll be able to see that throughout the lecture, how the Mongol Empire is really our first example of a more globalized society. It's not necessarily the first one. I mean, you could argue that the Roman Empire was a very globalized society encompassing much of the known world at the time, but that is kind of outside our area of study. So we'll focus in on the Mongol Empire. Let's go ahead and look at our essential questions. What are the various causes of international trading networks? We're really going to see that today. That's going to be very obvious and very evident in just a little bit. And then number 2, excuse me, what are the social, technological, cultural, and environmental effects of large trading networks? We've already seen some of these here, the social, technological, and cultural, and we'll talk about the environmental. I'll mention it a little bit today, and then we're really going to take a deep dive into the environmental effects of large trading networks in our subsequent lectures. Now, what we're going to do at the end of our synchronous learning session, so we're not going to do it asynchronously like we are doing right now, but we're going to do a four corners debate. Now, if this were the class, I would literally have you guys move to the four corners of the classroom. But obviously, things are going to be a little bit different here, so I will split you guys up a little bit differently. The important thing to know is that you're going to be creating claims, and you're going to back up those claims. I'm sorry, let's use a different terminology. You're going to support those claims using evidence. That is a very important part of this class. In your writing, you will have to create claims and support them with evidence. That's just a necessary component of AP World. We're going to practice that on a very small scale in our synchronous learning session for the Mongol Empire. Let's go ahead and get started with our quote of the day. Conquering the world on horseback is easy. It is dismounting and governing that is hard. Now, our first, and obviously this comes from Genghis Khan, who is the most famous Mongol, and is obviously, depending on your point of view, a very, very good person or a very, very bad person. There's actually a movement in Mongolia today, in the modern day, that wants to promote the legacy of Genghis Khan in a very positive light. Like, they're very, very proud of him. And we're going to see why that pride for Genghis Khan is a little bit controversial with all the things that he's done. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. He says, conquering the world is easy. It's easy to fight. After all, you just have to get men, you have to put them on horses, and have to have good archers, and you go and fight. And we'll see that. We'll see what the effects of this conquering and this use of violence, we'll see what the effects are. But we'll also see that it's incredibly difficult to govern. It's incredibly easy to complain about government. Trust me, everyone does it. Everyone complains about the president. Everyone complains about their prime minister. Everyone complains about whatever government happens to be in charge. But it is very, very difficult to govern. I am not envious of the people in government because they have a significantly harder job than I do. I just get to talk to a screen and they actually have to deal with people in real life. people often ask, well, why are you a teacher? I mean, isn't dealing with students just horrible and terrible? I mean, they're just these little teenagers who are just constantly being jerks to one another and all that. And I say, you know what? You're not wrong there, because teenagers are like that, but they are significantly better than adults. And people in government have to deal with other adults all the time. And I am not envious of that, because I would much rather deal with teenagers than adults here. Genghis Khan probably thinks the same thing. He thinks that governing is incredibly difficult, and we're going to see the difficulties that governing brings a little bit later in our lecture. Let's go ahead, we'll skip the partner reading, we'll skip our rally, and we'll look at this map here. So this is the Mongol Empire at its height. What we're going to see is that they're going to come from the north of China, from Mongolia. I mean, it's why they're the Mongol Empire. They will eventually expand all throughout China, all throughout the Middle East, where the Abbasid Caliphate, or at least part of the Abbasid Caliphate, used to be. They won't get all the way to the Mamluk Sultanate. They will not get to the Delhi Sultanate either in India, nor will they get to Japan. We'll talk about those things a little bit later. And then up here in the north, they'll actually get all the way out to Kiev. I know the map doesn't show it, but they'll get all the way out right about here. So they're not going to take over all of Europe, but they're going to take over most of Eurasia. Now you might be wondering, what's this? Golden Horde, the Khanate, the Yuan dynasty, the Ilkha Khanate. We're going to talk about those things a little bit later, but what we'll see is that Mongol Empire is going to be split up, and we'll talk about the effects of that split a little bit later. I just at least wanted to give you a map here so you guys have an understanding of what part of the world I'm talking about. Excuse me, let's go ahead and talk about the beginnings here. So the Mongols were pastoral and they were nomadic. What we have not talked about in this class, and I apologize because I should have mentioned it in a previous lecture, is that there are nomadic people in Asia. I mean, here were the Mongols. They were nomads. They were pastoral. They grew food and they moved around frequently. Here in Central Asia, right here, were other nomadic people, like the Seljuk Turks, if you remember our study of the Abbasid Caliphate and of the Crusades. Now, these nomadic people in this area and this area are incredibly important in the history of the world, because eventually they stop being nomadic and they start taking over other areas. Like we saw the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks said, you know what? We're not going to be nomadic anymore. We're going to start taking land from the Abbasid Caliphate and taking land from the Byzantine Empire. Well, the same thing, excuse me, same thing is going to happen here with the Mongols. So they're going to be these pastoral nomadic people who eventually all form together in order to start taking over land. Now, what brings them together? Because remember, this is Conrad de Mars model part one. You have a bunch of people in separate societies, and someone or something needs to bring them together. And that was step two. The person who is going to bring them together is right here. This is Genghis Khan, who's born as Temujin, or oftentimes his name is Chinggis Khan. And so you'll see different spellings of his name. I believe one of the spellings Chinggis is like Chingis. I believe it's something of that nature. I might have that spelled incorrectly, but it's obviously all the same person. Now, he needs to unite the Mongols in order to conquer other lands. How is he uniting them? Is this a common language? Is this a common religion? It's neither of those. I mean, those do exist, but those aren't the big common unifying factor. The big common unifying factor is their hatred towards China. Remember, they're up here in Mongolia. China, home of the Song dynasty, is down here. And we said in Unit 1 that the Song dynasty is centralizing its control within China. And one of the ways it's doing so is by eliciting tribute payments. And remember, we said that tribute payment is when a big country pretty much bullies a little country into giving them a whole lot of money. Well, the people who get bullied, they're tired of being bullied. They're sick and tired of the Chinese coming in, bullying them, taking their money away from them, and using it to enrich themselves. And Genghis Khan says, you know what? I'm sick and tired of this. We're going to get everyone together and we're going to stand up to that bully. And we're going to take back our money. We're going to take back our land and we're going to get what's ours. And the people love this. So they have a common enemy to organize around. And starting in 1206, Genghis Khan is going to start to go out and he is going to start to take over. And we're going to see that he is vastly successful. And we'll talk about why he's so successful a little bit later. So, as we see here, and this map is actually really good for showing the expansion of the Mongol Empire. So, you see it starts very small right here, and then grows. And this is actually very, very rapid growth. I mean, if you really think about it, if you look at the years here, this is 1206, and by 1219 or even like 1227, they've already doubled or tripled in size. I mean, if you're a person who was maybe 10 years old in 1206, where you're seeing Genghis Khan first start to take control, by the time you're in your 30s, the Mongol Empire has doubled or tripled its size. So that is a rapid expansion there. And we see that he's going to extend all the way from the Pacific Ocean to the northern part of Europe, all the way over here. This last part right there, where they split up, we'll talk about that closer to the end of class because that split is incredibly important and has profound impacts on those societies. Now, why are the Mongols successful? This is an example of their technology that they are using in order to be successful. The first part is their training. Mongol boys are taught to ride horses at an incredibly young age. This isn't a society like ours where everyone goes to school and learns math and English and science. No, no, no. If you are a boy in the Mongol Empire, you get on a horse and you learn how to be an archer. That is your job. That is what you are supposed to do. I've kind of already alluded to this, but archery is another big part of the Mongol success. They're able to be very quick on horseback and they can shoot in any direction, as you see here. This guy can turn all the way around and fire behind him as he's running away from you. And that's very difficult to hit. He's firing at you and moving away. There's no way you're going to be able to attack him. But the most important aspect as to why the Mongols were successful is because of their speed. The Mongol horses were a little bit smaller than a standard horse during that time period and had incredible endurance, being able to cover, as I said, about 60 to 100 miles a day, and sometimes even more than that. They could just move incredibly quickly. They could get from one city to another and take over before that city even knew what was going on. And they would travel faster than the word about their arrival. That's how quickly they would move and they would be able to take over cities. Speed and organization is the key to military success. We see that with the Mongols now. You have to be able to move fast and catch your enemy by surprise. But we'll also see that Napoleon is going to use the same tactic. Why is Napoleon successful in the beginning of the 1800s? Because he's quick. He's faster. He's more organized than anyone else. We'll also see it again in the 1930s and 1940s with Adolf Hitler in Germany. Why is Adolf Hitler such a military success? Not that I want to give Hitler any credit because he certainly doesn't deserve it, but why is he a military success? Because he moves quickly. He's an incredibly organized individual. So I want you to keep that in mind, that speed and organization are the key to success, because when we do talk about Napoleon and we do talk about Adolf Hitler, I will talk about the Mongols as well. Now, the one difference between the Mongols and Napoleon and Hitler is that the Mongols were actually successful in taking Russia while Hitler and Napoleon were not. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Here's the big empire, and this is just for comparison purposes. We often talk about how big the Roman Empire is, and we say, oh, the Roman Empire is so big, so wonderful. And it truly was. I mean, the Roman Empire is such an important part of history. But as you can see, the Mongol Empire is significantly larger. This is the biggest, largest land empire in the history of the world. It is absolutely gigantic. But if we're thinking about the Conrad de Mars model, and we are thinking about especially part number 4, we know that oftentimes empires expand too far. They engage in overexpansion, and they're unable to secure their borders, and they start to fall apart. This is ultimately why the Mongol Empire is going to rise so quickly, but then fall very quickly as well, as we'll see. The Roman Empire is around for an incredibly long time. And the Roman Empire was, Rome started to be established in 700 BC. And we said that the Roman Empire fell in 476 CE. So that's a long time to be around. The Mongols, it's going to be 100, maybe 150 years or so, and then they fall. And so it's a very quick rise, a very quick fall. Why not India? Why not Japan? So if you look at the map, Japan over here not being taken over, India not being taken over. Well, with India right here, we have the Himalayan mountains. We have Mount Everest here. It's just really difficult to get over that mountain in order to attack India, and probably not worth it. This, yeah, while there are mountain ranges here, it's not as difficult to get over. So it's much easier to expand this way as opposed to expanding to India. In addition to that, Mongol horses would not have been successful in the Indian climate, so it was not in their best interest to invade India. Japan, on the other hand, was incredibly lucky. What happened in Japan is that the Mongols attempted to cross via water. So here's Japan over here. It's a little off the map. The Mongols actually did make an attempt, but 2 times they were stopped by these almost hurricane-like winds that blew them back to the coast of their own society. They did it once, were blown back. They did it again, were blown back and said, you know what? That's probably a sign that we should not attack Japan. And so Japan was saved. Japan was never taken over by the Mongols, for better or for worse, depending on your point of view on the Mongols. Let's go ahead and talk about the impact. So we looked at all the great things with the Mongol Empire. We looked at their expansion. What ultimately is their impact? After all, this is an empire that's not around for that long. I mean, we're going to see that yes, they rise in 1206, but by 1368 and 1369, they've really fallen apart and people have retaken their societies. So why is this so important? Well, it's highly impactful. The first part is the Pax Mongolica. This is actually very similar to the Pax Romana, if you remember from your 8th grade history class. If it's probably been a couple years since you've been in that class, so maybe you don't. But with the Pax Romana, this area right here was very peaceful, mainly because everyone was in the same country. Everyone had or in the same empire. Everyone had the same ideas. Everyone had the same values. Everyone, obeyed the same governor, obeyed the same emperor. So things were relatively peaceful. The Mongols, it is, I understand, a bit of a oxymoron there, because the Mongols create peace through violence. I mean, Genghis Khan is a very violent individual, uses violence to overthrow all of these people and all of these cities in Eurasia, and then establishes peace for 100 years. So yes, I understand it's oxymoronic, but when everyone is under one centralized rule, things can be fairly peaceful. Two, those trade routes. We talked about the importance of the trade routes. We talked about the exchange of goods. And we even talked about the exchange of cultures as well, such as languages and religions and customs and all these great, wonderful things that we looked at in our previous lecture. That's because of the Mongols. We said that without having a centralized society, trade becomes much more difficult. When you do have a centralized society, trade becomes much easier. And so people are much more likely to trade. And so the Mongols are responsible for the recreation of the Silk Road. They're responsible for all of this knowledge and technology, and also the Black Death, getting all the way over from China to Europe. And we'll talk about those things more and more throughout the year. I will say this, because we've been working on context as well. If we are going to write about Europe, especially in the 1400s, and we are writing about how they have all this technology that eventually allows them to cross the Atlantic Ocean, the Mongol Empire is our context. That's a very necessary component as to explaining why all this technology from over here got all the way over here. So do keep that in mind. I want you to keep in mind that all of these things that I'm talking about, yes, are important for this unit, but are important for subsequent units because they build context for them. Let's go ahead and look at other long-term effects. So as I said, knowledge is going to move all the way over to Europe. Now, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad will be destroyed by Hulagu Khan in 1258. So that will be destroyed, and that is a horrible aspect of the Mongol history, because it's similar to the burning of the library at Alexandria. I mean, you're losing all of this knowledge and technology. Imagine if we shut down the internet. People would lose access to all this great knowledge and technology that we have. And yes, the internet does have a lot of knowledge and technology. It's not just full of Twitter spats and TikTok dances. There are actually really, really good things on the internet, which you should use the internet for instead of doing your little TikTok dance challenge. I don't look. I know I'm wearing a sweater right here and I got the tie on. So clearly I'm not the guy who knows whole lot about TikTok, but I do know it's all about dancing. And I think it's a waste of a wonderful resource that we have via the internet. But that's just me. I'm just one guy. That's my opinion there. This house of wisdom was destroyed, but still all this knowledge and technology, the algebra, the astronomy, the Greek text that we saw translated in the House of Wisdom in our study of the Abbasid Caliphate, well, all of that knowledge is still going to be transferred to Europe, which will play a key part in the development of the Renaissance that we'll talk about later. We'll have a lot of time to talk about the bubonic plague, but one of the negative aspects about this Silk Road that the Mongols have established is that disease is going to travel via the Silk Road as well. And we're going to see that's incredibly devastating when you get over to Europe and society has become a bit more urbanized. And we'll talk more about that because we'll give the bubonic plague its own day where we could really take a deep dive and look at it. And the last one is the cannon and the use of gunpowder. This will come up time and time again because what we see is that in China, they have the use of gunpowder, and eventually guns and cannons are created because guns and cannons use gunpowder. All of that knowledge, the knowledge and technology of gunpowder, gets transferred to the Middle East and gets transferred to Europe. And in Unit 3, we're going to see kings and queens. We're going to see the leaders of these societies use guns, use gunpowder, use cannons in order to centralize their rule. Guns and gunpowder are so important that we have empires called the gunpowder empires. We're going to see the Ottomans and the Safavids and the Mughal dynasty here in this particular area. All of them gained their power and centralized their power because of gunpowder. And we'll take a deep dive and look at them in Unit 3. But know that the reason that gunpowder is so prevalent in Eurasia is because of the Mongol Empire. Now let's talk about the division of the empire. The Mongols believed in this idea, as many empires do, that each son should have a part of the empire. So if you only have one son, I mean, that's fairly straightforward. When you die, your son gets the whole empire. But what if you have multiple sons? What if you have multiple wives and those wives have multiple sons? Well, now this starts to get a little more confusing, right? Because all of these different individuals now have a claim to the throne. And we're going to see that many empires, including the Mongols, obviously, divide up their empire because there may be two or three people who have a claim to the throne. And instead of fighting one another, they say, you know what, you take the western half, I'll take the eastern half, and we'll call it even there. Not every empire is going to do this. Notably, the Ottoman Empire in Unit 3 is not going to do this. They are going to have this idea of unigeniture. Keep the empire together. Do not split it up. Even if all the brothers have to fight against one another, even if they have to go to war and there is a civil war amongst the brothers and amongst all of the people who have a claim to the throne, keep the empire as one. And we'll see kind of why the Ottomans stress that so much, because we'll see some of the issues that take place with the Mongol Empire. Usually, when you divide up a big empire like this, each individual part is weaker, and so they're unable to protect themselves. Unable to protect themselves. Apologize for that. Um, and so they end up falling apart. And so we see this time and time again throughout history. When empires split up, usually that's kind of the beginning of the end. So we're going to talk about three of the splits. We'll talk about the Golden Horde, we'll talk about the Yuan dynasty, and we'll talk about the Ilkhan dynasty or the Ilkhanate. Um, those both mean the same thing. The Ilkhan and the Ilkhanate are essentially the same thing. So what's the Golden Horde? Well, Kiev, right here. So we know from our one of our previous lectures that Kiev is a part of Russia. All right, so this is modern day Russia right here. What does the Golden Horde do? Well, they force tribute payments on the people who were already here, namely the Vikings, the Rus, who came into what is now called Russia. We saw that that is Conrad Demar's model part three. I mean, you're eliciting tribute payments. That's not the first time we've talked about tribute, and that certainly won't be the last time that we've talked about tribute. They're also going to rule through intermediaries. The Mongols are. What we need to realize is that the Mongols are a minority. There are significantly more Russians than there are Mongols. So, how is it that a minority population is controlling a majority population? Well, they control through intermediaries. For example, if I were king of a society, we'll say. And me and my people are the minority, and all of these other people, well, they are a majority. There's no way I'm going to be able to rule over all of them. I just don't have enough people, and they have significantly more people than I do. But I do have some resources. I have money. I may have gunpowder. I may have all of these things that allow me to be in charge, and I can work with the people at the very top, the like upper echelon of that society. So I can work with the princes and I can say, look, if you do what I tell you to do and you rule in the way that I want you to rule, I will make you incredibly wealthy. And so now I don't have to worry about anything. I let them take care of everything. And because they are much more similar to the majority of the people are going to like them. I still get everything I want, which is I get to be in charge and I still get a whole lot of money and I obtain my resources and people are not revolting against me. The prince gets everything he wants. He gets more money and he still gets to retain his power and his title as prince. And the people get what they want because they don't want to be ruled by an outsider. They are still ruled by someone who is just like them. So, this rule through intermediaries is a very good way to run a society. We see that the Mongols are going to do it. And if we fast forward all the way to the 1700s and the 1800s, the British are going to do it in India as well. So there are multiple examples we have of ruling through intermediaries. I know my example wasn't the most perfect explanation of it, and so we'll talk about it more in our synchronous session when we have a chance. Now, what's important to remember here, and we'll actually look at this in our synchronous session as well, is that this rule is going to have a profound impact on Russian society that will last all the way until 1917. The Mongols are obsessed with a strong man ruler, as in all the power should belong to one individual. That way, that one individual can run everything, and it will be highly organized. And you might say, "Well, that's tyrannical. That's bad." Well, look at our Congress today. We have 535 people in our Congress in Washington D.C., and then we have the president and his entire cabinet as well. No one on earth is going to say that that is a organized and efficient way to run things. Most people are going to say, oh my goodness, that is chaotic. There's just too many people with too many opinions who are subtweeting each other way too much and causing so much chaos that our society is a complete mess. We should just have one person in charge, put that person in charge, let them make all the decisions, organize everything, stop arguing with one another. And that idea of running an entire society through one person is something that the Russians are going to take. And they're going to have the czar. And the czar is going to be the supreme lord of Russia. He's going to be the temporal ruler and the spiritual ruler of Russia. And we'll talk about that more when we get into Russia in our later units. But that idea of having a strong man, of running your entire society through one person, that comes from the Mongols. And so that is an example of the long-term impacts of culture. When we get to our synchronous learning, someone who is far more intelligent than I am is going to explain that to you. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we do get to our synchronous session. In 1380, Moscow finally defeats the Golden Horde, and we'll talk about that more in Unit 3. We'll see the rise of Ivan the Great and Ivan the Terrible, and then eventually the Romanov dynasty with Peter the Great as well. The last thing I do want to talk about, and it's something that's not on the slide, is an individual named Jan Ebeg. So this is the part of the world we're talking about right there. Now, Yanni Beg is around in 1346. He is the leader of the Golden Golden Horde. 1346, as you'll learn a little bit later, is around the time of the bubonic plague, and specifically when the bubonic plague finally gets all the way from here and into Europe. Now, what Yanni Beg did is that he went to Kaffa, which is a city here, right there. There you go, on that little, almost that like little island right there. Now, at Kaffa, there's a castle. The city has high walls. It's very difficult to get through, and that's put in for protective purposes, obviously. And so Yanni Beg is trying to take over Kaffa. He's running a siege. He keeps bombarding the wall. He keeps sending more men in order to try to break through the wall to get into the city in order to take over. And he's unsuccessful. It's so difficult to get through the wall. The people repel him away, and he's getting frustrated. He doesn't know what to do. Now, what he's done is he's bringing these large catapults, and he has been flinging massive rocks at the city over and over and over, trying to knock down the walls and not being successful. And so he tells his men, put more rocks on those catapults and keep launching them. And the men say, Sir, Yanni Beg, we are out of rocks. We don't have any more weapons. There's nothing we can do. And Yanni Beg just puts his head in his hands and doesn't know what to do. I mean, he can't lose. He's a Khan. He's part of the Mongol Empire. He has to be able to win, just like other Khans, like Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan's pretty much undefeated in his conquest over Eurasia. And so Yanni Beg looks around, and what he sees is that many of his men have started dying of this very mysterious disease, this horrible, terrible disease that turns your skin this very, very dark, almost like a dark purple that gets bumps, these buboes that are on your skin. Now, unbeknownst to Yanni Beg, that is the bubonic plague. And Yanni Beg's around 1346, so he doesn't understand how disease is transmitted. If he did, he would certainly make a lot of different decisions. And so he looks and he sees his men who are dead on the ground with this horrible pestilence, with this horrible disease, and he gets an idea. He says, put them on the cattle. And the men look at Yanni Beg and say, Sir, you must be insane. I mean, that is absolutely crazy. And Yanni Beg says, I'm crazy enough to take over that city. Do what I told you. The men say, okay, sir. And they take the dead, diseased bodies, put them on the catapult, and start launching them over the walls of Kaffa. So you need to imagine what this would be like. Imagine you're a citizen of Kaffa. Imagine you're just walking around the city, enjoying yourself. And eventually, every once in a while, you kind of look out and you're like, oh, yeah, there's some Mongols over there. Hopefully they don't attack us. We got really nice sturdy walls here, so I don't feel scared. I feel pretty safe. And then all of a sudden you look up, and there are bodies of dead people flying over the walls and landing on houses, landing on people, landing on animals, destroying your city. You would reasonably go nuts. You would start running around screaming as loud as you can, because this feels like it is the end of the world. What we see is that siege of Kaffa is the first example of biological warfare using disease and biology instead of just standard weapons in order to take over a city. Ultimately, Yanni Beg is successful at taking over Kaffa. Eventually, that disease, the bubonic plague, is going to spread into Europe. Now, is it just because of Yanni Beg's siege at Kaffa? No, I mean, maybe that's part of it, but there's certainly a lot more to it than that, as we'll talk about later. But I thought that was an interesting story about the Golden Horde, and it's going to tie into our later lecture about the bubonic plague. Let's go ahead and talk about the Ilkhanate. So the Ilkhanate right here. So what we have is kind of the Sinai Peninsula right here, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey's like right over here, okay? And Constantinople is a little bit off the map. So this is where the Abbasid Caliphate used to be. What we see with the Ilkhanate, what's important is one, that Hulagu Khan destroys Baghdad in 1258. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. These two are the very, very important parts. You would think that when the Mongols roll in to what was formerly the Abbasid Caliphate, they're going to impose their culture upon that society. They're going to say, we're the Mongols. We do things the Mongol way. You're going to do things our way, or we're going to kill you. I mean, that's what you would assume. But the Mongols don't do that. And in fact, the great empires of society don't ever do that. The Romans, who were this massive society, did not necessarily always push and force Roman culture on people. They allowed people to keep their culture as long as they, were peaceful and paid taxes when they were supposed to. That's what the Ilkhanate does. The Ilkhanate doesn't say, "Hey, you better switch to what we're doing." The Ilkhanate says, "We're going to do what you guys are doing. We see that you guys are Muslim. We see that that's a very important part of your society. It's a very important part of your culture. So we're going to take that. We're going to be Muslim too." And so this is an example of conquering societies taking the cultures of the conquered society. I know. I just want to make sure I got my verbiage right there. So the conquerors take the culture of the conquered. This is an example of that. So when it's on the test and it says what is an example of a conquering society using the culture of a conquered society, the Ilkhanate using Islam is an example. Mongols convert to the Muslim faith in order to rule over their society. And just like we saw with the Golden Horde, they want to use the local rulers. We saw that the Golden Horde ruled through intermediaries. Well, the Ilkhanate is going to be the same way. Those local rulers, those Muslim local rulers who are already there, they're powerful. They have a lot of resources, they have a lot of money, and they probably have a lot of popularity as well. You want to be able to work with them. What's the best way to work with them? Have the same culture, have the same religion. In addition to converting to Islam, the Ilkhanate will introduce gunpowder and cannons to this region as well, which is going to be very, very important in Unit 3. Let's go ahead and move on to our last one, which is the Yuan dynasty. Song dynasty overthrown in 1279 by Kublai Khan, and who establishes the Yuan dynasty. This is another example of the Mongols using the culture of their conquered subjects to their advantage. So instead of coming in and saying you're going to obey everything that we tell you to tell you because we're the Mongols and we're imposing our culture on you, that's not how it's going to work. The Mongols come in and say, let's use what's already here in order to rule over the people. This would relate more to Conrad Demar's model number 3, where we see that you try to get people to identify with the state. So like number 2, but then also number 3, where you give people what they want and you make them happy. So there's a little bit of both there. There's using the governmental systems that are already in place and the cultural and social systems that are already in place in order to get people to identify with the state. That was a big part of especially number 2. And so that's going to continue for the Mongols as well. They're going to use that. We know that the Song dynasty had a very expansive bureaucracy. So let's use it. That's what the Mongols say. Why don't we just use that bureaucracy? People are used to this. We're going to use it. They like it. And so we like it. However, they're going to change things up a little bit. They will remove those Confucian exams, which is going to make people incredibly upset with them. And we'll talk about the downfall of the Yuan dynasty in a little bit. They're also going to make the Mongols the highest rank. Remember, those Confucian exams were open to everyone. If you were a poor person, you could study, you could take those exams and move up in society. The Mongols say, you know what? If you're Chinese, yeah, you can work in the bureaucracy, but you're never going to get to the highest levels of bureaucracy. Those are reserved for people who are Mongol, people like us. And so we see that because they change things up a little bit, that's going to cause some problems for them down the road. But one thing they do use to get people on their side, and this is going to be a big part of Unit 3, because we will be discussing religious tolerance and religious intolerance, is that the Mongols have religious tolerance. We saw that with the Ilkhanate. They were very tolerant of Islam, and so Islam remained the dominant religion of that area. The Mongols are going to be very tolerant of Buddhists and Taoists, who are incredibly happy. I mean, think about it. They've been ruled by the Song dynasty, which is clearly a Confucian dynasty, and they've been ruled for an incredibly long time. The Buddhists and the Taoists have wanted to have religious tolerance. They have wanted to have their say in government for a long time, and finally they have it because those exams are removed. So this does give the Yuan dynasty a little bit of popularity, but not enough popularity because the Buddhists and Taoists are still minorities in the Chinese society. There's still going to be many people who believe in those Confucian classics who are going to be upset with that. And that is where we get to the decline. All of this is Conrad DeMar's model part four. All of it. I mean, part four is about the collapse. This is about the collapse. First of all, it's too large. We already looked at the map. We see how big it is. It's incredibly difficult to run a society that large and to protect a society that large. It's very easy for these societies to stop paying tribute. We saw that with the Abbasid Caliphate. The Mamluks said, "Make me pay tribute, make me pay taxes." Oh, you can't make me. What are you going to do? Bring down your army? We're going to see that the Russians do that, and we'll talk about that more in unit three. We'll start to see that things are just going to fall apart because it's too large, it's too difficult. As Genghis Khan said at the beginning, governing is hard, and that is true with the Mongols. The Yuan dynasty destroys the civil service exam, upsetting many. Because they destroy that civil service exam, the people of China, the people who were formerly under the Song dynasty, are incredibly upset. They're mad that they do not have that key part of their society. They will eventually overthrow in 1368 the Yuan dynasty and replace them with the Ming, who will bring back many of those traditional aspects of Chinese culture, such as the civil service exam. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the Ming dynasty in later units. We also see that the Golden Horde is going to be driven out by 1369, and then Russia will belong to the Russians starting in 1380. And so, that's another part that ties into our first part up here, which is about the society being too large. There's the divided empire. As we saw, because the Mongols divided up their empire up to four different parts, they weren't as powerful, they weren't as strong, and so they ended up falling away. But the last one I want to bring up, and I apologize for hopping around a little bit, I should have reorganized this, is the Black Death. The Black Death is going to originate in the East. It's going to cause a whole lot of problems for the Yuan dynasty and for the rest of the Mongol Khanates as well, like the Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde. Eventually, that's going to travel to Europe, and that's going to cause problems over there as well. What I find very surprising, and I don't know if there's a reason for this or not, I don't think there is, I think it's purely coincidental, is that there's a disease that originates in China and spreads to the rest of the world. So it's not the first time or I guess the coronavirus is not the first time that something like that has happened. Once again, I don't think there's really a tie or really any sort of lesson to be learned from history about that, but I do think it's purely coincidental that that a disease from the East ends up affecting the entire world. We're going to stop there with our lecture today. Now, what we'll get to in our synchronous learning is we'll get to our four corners. Here's going to be the four sentences that you're going to be looking at. So what I want you to do is I want you to start thinking about your opinion, whether you agree with these sentences or not. So you can agree that Genghis Khan is a hero, or you can disagree and you can say Genghis Khan is a villain, or at least not a hero, shouldn't be treated as one. But I want you to go beyond that. Because whenever you have an opinion or whenever you make a claim, you have to support it with evidence. So I don't want you to say, well, Genghis Khan is a hero. I want you to think Genghis Khan is a hero, and here is why I think that. And start looking for pieces of evidence, start looking for reasons, start thinking of explanations why. Because when we get to class, we're going to have a discussion on these four sentences. You'll need to practice creating claims and supporting them with evidence because that is an integral part of AP World History. Ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up our lecture on the Mongol Empire. Please make sure you answer all the questions in the Ed puzzle. Please make sure that if you need to, you go back. Please also make sure that you are taking notes. That way you have a good understanding of what's going on, and I'll see you for our next lecture.